feeling all right. I lost a few pounds since I saw you.
You got really
Been working out.
Wow.
Okay, I'm set. KCCI,
Yeah.
Channel 8.
Yeah, remember?
No.
We're just going to ask you one quick question.
Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this podcast, we talk about the stories behind songs, artists, and legends, as well as moments in history and history in the making. The whole reason I started this channel in the first place was to tell these stories of divine music intervention. You know, growing up, I loved listening to interviews and documentaries about various rock stars and famous guitarists, and I always noticed one common thread. In every icon's story, there was one common theme and one moment, or maybe a series of moments, that you just couldn't explain how the pieces fell together so perfectly. It seems like the only explanation for a lot of those moments, it's divine intervention. And so I pegged the term divine music intervention, meaning these little moments in the music industry where that person is at the right place at just the right time to meet that person, and it turns into something so beautiful that ultimately results in music that the world didn't even know it needed. So when the news broke on October 16th, 2025, that Ace Frehley had died, the first thing I thought of was how his story is just the epitome of divine music intervention, but over and over and over again. Like, I don't know anyone's story that has that many moments of divine music intervention, and it is such a fun story to tell. For Ace, like I said, it's not just one moment of divine music intervention. He had multiple strikes of really, really good luck. In this episode, we pay tribute to the man behind the makeup and deep dive into how this man electrified the world of rock and roll. Keep in mind, you all, that I am limited in what I can show you on YouTube. I am not an authorized documentary. I do not have all of the song rights and copyright rights to give you music and to give you actual images and all of that jazz. Okay, I'm just a YouTuber who loves rock and roll, who loves music, and who loves history and loves telling stories. So this is more of a conversational podcast. I am also, if you look at the bottom here, I'm also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And actually, I realized in my last episode that this was kind of cut off by a couple different screens. So maybe I should move it like over here. Is that weird? Anyways, I am anywhere that you can find a podcast, whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on. Amazon podcasts, whatever, you just put it in a feed and it goes out everywhere. So wherever you listen to your podcasts, go look for Roots Music History. I am also on Instagram. If you don't know me, hello. If you are a new listener, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I am very excited to tell you the story of Ace Frehley. So go ahead and grab a blanket, grab a cup of tea, grab a coffee. If you're cleaning, get your earbuds in, get all set. If you're driving, put the volume up and settle in, because this is going to be a long one. Initially, this video was going to be very, 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 very long, to the point where I have decided to cut it into two different parts. So this is part one, where we are going to discuss Ace's early life, his childhood, how he met Kiss and how he got involved in it a little bit. But part two is really where we're going to talk about the band Kiss. So this is the early days of Ace Frehley.
My given name is Paul.
No, not that
No,
name.
the name we know you by.
My professional name is Ace Frehley.
Yay! Now we know how to pronounce it.
Okay, because you know what was driving us crazy? I mean, even though you've been famous for over 40 years, we hear your name pronounced two different ways by people.
1 month and 2 days after Easter in 1951, a devout German Lutheran woman named Esther gave birth to her third and final child, whom she named Paul Daniel, aka Ace. But we're going to call him Paul for the time being because that is his given name. Paul Daniel was born at the Bronx, Lebanon Hospital in New York City. His middle name, Daniel, was a tribute to his father and his older brother. His father, Carl Frehley, already had a firstborn son with his full name, Carl Daniel Jr., so when Esther found out they were pregnant again and that it was a boy, she chose her favorite name from the Bible, which was Paul. Some accounts also suggest the name Paul also honored a family friend who was part of their church, who was very close to the Frehleys, and that they wanted to name their son after this person. Also, Esther loved the name Paul from the Bible as well. Now, it's possible Paul was a surprise baby. It's possible. You don't know for sure. But just to paint the picture for you, Esther and Carl had married in 1941. Now, by 1941, Carl was 38 years old and had already lost his mother, his father, and his baby brother. He had no family, but he had fallen in love with 21-year-old Esther Anna Margaret. A couple years into their marriage, Esther gave birth to their firstborn, Carl Daniel Jr., and then a couple years later, she gave birth to Paul's older sister, Nancy. By the time Paul was born, and this is why I say it's possible he was a surprise, Carl and Nancy were roughly 6 and 3 years old, and the family was living in a 2-bedroom, a very small 2-bedroom flat at 2985 Marion Avenue. Apartment B4, I believe, to be exact. This apartment was in the Bronx, not far from the New York Botanical Garden and the Bronx Zoo, if you are familiar with the area. And these apartments, by the way, are estimated on Zillow now to be worth about $700,000, but they are still very, very small. After Paul's birth, his parents moved things around in the apartment so that Carl Jr., who they nicknamed Charlie, by the way, and Paul could have their own bedroom, and Nancy had the second bedroom to herself. But that left nowhere for the parents to sleep. So his parents then began sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the living room. And this is a setup that they would have for about 18 years. Until Paul moved out of the house, and he was one of the last children to move out. But no surprise there, guitarist life. Now, from the records I saw, it does appear the family held this residence up until Carl Sr.'s death, or at least just a few years before his death. Him and Esther did end up at a Lutheran senior citizen facility in Saginaw, Michigan, but it appears they held on to their property in the Bronx here until the very end. So whenever I talk about Paul, aka Ace, being home with his parents, I'm referring to this very small 2-bedroom flat in the Bronx, shared with his siblings. I couldn't find the interior of this exact unit, of Unit B4 anywhere, but here is a unit that is almost right next door to give you an idea of how small this apartment really was for, remember, a family of 5. We've got 3 kids and 2 adults. Although it is small for a family of 5, this was still not a bad upbringing for the family. It could have been a lot worse, but you could tell how his parents were smart with their money and how they cared for their kids. They really tried to put their kids' needs above their own, and a prime example of this is by giving the children private bedrooms while they slept on a pull-out couch. Paul's father was an electrical engineer who really valued work ethic and living life on a straight line. Although his father wasn't overly religious, unlike Esther, who was strongly Lutheran, Carl Sr. did have a very strong sense of spirituality. And his spirituality was strengthened by a freak incident that happened at work once. It was a regular work day, and every day the electrical engineers would pull straws to see who would be stuck with the task of going out and getting sandwiches and lunch for the crew. One day, his dad drew the short straw. He had never drawn it before, but on this particular day, he did. He left to go get sandwiches for his team, and when he came back, he found his co-workers hanging lifeless off of high-tension wires. Every single one of his co-workers had been electrocuted in a freak accident that apparently was caused by someone who had accidentally thrown on a switch and restored power to the area where the men were working. Carl Frehley was the one who found them, and this haunted him. He told his kids about that moment and about how incredibly blessed he was to have pulled the short straw that day. He told them how if he hadn't, he would have been up there working and he would be gone. Now, this actually haunted Ace for years, even though his father intended this story to be somewhat uplifting that, miracles happen, this really troubled him as a child. He says he would have nightmares about men hanging lifeless, about his dad hanging lifeless and electrocuted. But his dad always followed up this story by saying to Ace, sometimes you get lucky. And that theme, sometimes you get lucky, reverberated through Paul's life time and time again, all the way up until he becomes the guitarist we know today, Ace. Now, Paul's father wasn't just hardworking and good with his money. He was genuinely brilliant. He would build his own batteries and tinker with motors and electrical circuits all the time, in the same way that Paul eventually became fascinated with computers and guitars. His dad also enjoyed music. Several people close to the family recall his father being able to play classical music on the piano just flawlessly. Both of his parents also always emphasized religion and education to their kids, as well as encouraging them to pursue music. Paul's older brother and sister, Nancy, both took piano lessons and would perform at recitals all the time. But his childhood was not all ditties. I don't know, I was trying to come up with something funny. Because living in the Bronx, it was easy to get involved with the wrong people. In fact, it was almost a form of survival as a kid that you had to be involved with some of these rough crowds. When Paul was 12 years old, his brother and sister started taking up guitar in addition to piano, and they decided to join a little folk group, duet with each other. They invited Paul to join, but Paul didn't want to. He says he was way more into the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. He was a rocker, even back then. At 12 years old, Paul picked up his first electric guitar. He remembers plugging it in, turning the amp as high as it would go, and strummed a power chord and fell in love. Within a few months, he had a Fender Tele and a Marsh amp in his room. His dad was actually the one who bought him his very first electric guitar, technically, as a Christmas present. It was a Gibson Melody Maker double cutaway in TV yellow. 1 year later, when Paul was 13, he joined his first band called the Four Roses. It was comprised of him, his older brother Charlie, and another friend who was in the neighborhood, also was part of a neighborhood gang, named Joey. Now, Joey, Charlie, and Paul, they played all sorts of cover songs. And Paul remembers after a few months, his older brother Charlie started to let him play lead guitar on some of these songs. At the time, Paul just thought his brother was being really nice. But looking back, Paul thinks that his older brother Charlie was the first person to recognize his potential as a guitarist. Paul never took formal guitar lessons, which I think is important to note, although many guitar daddies don't, but he didn't need to. You could tell he was born with an understanding for music, and he would just pick up whatever his dad and siblings were doing. He'd listen to a song and just figure it out. He would watch his brother, watch his sister, watch his dad, and just copy them, monkey see, monkey do. One of his favorite pastimes was to put records on, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and just mimic, just begin playing exactly how the record was playing, without anyone telling him how. Something else he figured out quite quickly was the security that you had as a teenager in the Bronx if you were initiated into a gang. And I think playing with Joey and his older brother is really what enlightened him to the benefits of this gang network, because Joey was part of a neighborhood gang called the Duckies. Now, the Duckies were kind of intense, so intense, in fact, that there was another little gang called the Junior Duckies. They were a little bit younger and not as hardcore as the Duckies. But to be clear, we are talking about the gangs of 1950 in New York, so not really the types of gangs you see today, okay? There is a really big difference. These gangs were not formal criminal organizations by any means. They were small street crews made up of mostly young teenagers who drank beer, and maybe they would throw snowballs at a cop. Just caused a general ruckus in the neighborhood, but were not actual felons. You know, they would cause maybe fist fights. That was kind of the worst of it. Maybe someone would steal from a store or break in somewhere. Petty crimes like that is really what you saw. Just a lot of fighting amongst the kids, you know, defending your turf, so to speak. But being part of one of these gangs meant you had an identity in the neighborhood. So Paul joined one. He mostly did it because of a girl. He liked this girl and she had an association with the Junior Duckies. And there was this unspoken rule, or maybe it was spoken, that you don't date a girl who is affiliated with a group that you're not affiliated with in the Bronx at the time. And he really wanted to date her. He says that was one of his main reasons for joining the Junior Duckies. And he entertained these friendships, but he did try to keep a distance from the people in these gangs for the most part. He says he saw the types of substances and trouble these guys were getting into, and he really didn't want to be a part of that. So he really did try to focus on his music and his playing, and would often use his music and playing as an excuse as to why he couldn't hang out with them or partake in certain activities. He admits he experimented with certain substances as a teenager, as a young boy, actually, 12, 13 years old. But mainly, he says, he really just wanted to stick to alcohol. It was the devil that he knew. When he first started getting involved in this lifestyle, his parents immediately fought back on him. His dad even told him, if you don't straighten out, we're going to kick you out of the house, which was a very small 2-bedroom flat. But Paul was like, fine, then I'm gone. And his parents were like, wait, what? And Paul left. He went to live with some loser musician who was in his early 20s named Duke. Duke didn't even pay his own rent, by the way. He lived in a building that his dad owned, and his dad had just happened to give him this little studio bedroom in the basement. And that's the only place Paul really thought he could go. He knew Duke from playing guitar with him a couple of times. Duke said he could come over and drink and smoke pot and bring his girlfriends over, which was really all Paul wanted to do as a 16-year-old at that time in that scene. So Paul lived with Duke for about 4 weeks until he realized this is probably not a good situation. And he was picking up on some behaviors of Duke that he didn't like. So Paul ended up making peace with his parents after just 4 weeks and moved back home with them. But soon after he moved back home, Duke actually got arrested and in some really big trouble with police. This was like a very dramatic arrest. The police actually came and questioned Paul in this 2-bedroom flat that his parents owned about his relationship with Duke and pressed him for details and things that he saw, things he knew. The whole thing was just really bad and really weird. Paul continuously says that even though the rock and roll lifestyle is what nearly killed him as an adult, he says it's also true that without music, he very well may have never made it to adulthood in the first place. After all, getting involved with the wrong people was easy for him as an adolescent. You know, people like Duke. And after moving back home with his parents, this really is where the dynamic seemed to shift between Paul and his folks. After Paul had ran away from home to live with Duke, and after this whole police incident, his parents were not as rigid with him anymore. You know, maybe his parents thought this must have really spooked him. I think that's what he needed, or whatever they thought. At this point, Paul was a senior in high school, and halfway through his senior year, he decides to drop out. Halfway through senior year, he is almost done and he drops out. He was solely focused on just partying, playing the guitar, and hooking up with girls, all right in front of his parents, because he lived right there. They were all right there in a 2-bedroom flat. And his parents let him do it. They let him come home late. They let him come home drunk. They didn't harp on him at all. He says he thinks him moving out and living with Duke at 16 also really scared them when he ran away, and they at least figured they preferred to know where he is each night and know that he's home. He also says that it sort of seemed like as long as he wasn't doing any real hard drugs or being brought home by the police, that his parents were also more willing to put up with it. And he also says, you know, his dad was older when he was born. I think he was 46 or 47 by the time Paul was born. So his dad was in his mid-60s, early 70s, while Paul is in his early 20s going out and doing all these things. He also says his dad might have just been older and Paul's the third kid and he just didn't have the energy to scold him anymore. And that might be true too. Who knows? But either way, despite all of his extracurricular activities, Paul always kept this spark inside of him, this feeling that he was going to do more in this world than just get effed up and F around with girls. And a lot of this encouragement came from a neighborhood kid named Peppy. Peppy played rhythm guitar and sang lead for a band called the Blue Magoos, and he lived just a few blocks away from Paul. Now, Paul did his best to become friends with Peppy. Every time he saw Peppy out at a local dive bar or a club, he'd go up to Peppy and strike up conversations. Eventually, he found himself in Peppy's basement in a jam session one night. And then after that, maybe a while after that, but one day after that, Paul was listening to the radio and one of the Blue Magoos songs came on. And Paul remembers just thinking, oh my gosh, that's Peppy. He lives right next door to me. That's him. He was like, he had dreamed, of being Clapton or Hendrix. But now seeing someone from his neighborhood, someone he had actually jammed with, make it on the radio, that meant that if Peppy could do it, so could he. But he still had no idea where to even begin. So he decided, hey, I'm just going to start acting the part. So he just started dressing and acting like a rock star, even though he most certainly was not one. He soon adopted the nickname Ace with his friends because dressing and acting like a rock star made him pretty popular with the ladies. So much so that he had so many girls flirting with him, he would start handing them off to his friends and giving his friends advice on how to pick up even more girls. His friends started saying things like, wow, man, thanks, man, you're such an ace. He's an ace. Isn't he an ace? And the nickname just stuck. Dressing and acting like a rock star didn't just land him success in the romance department, it also landed him success in the music scene. The old phrase, fake it till you make it, really worked out here. There was certainly a turning point in 1970, July 17th, 1970 to be exact. This was the first time Ace snuck backstage. And by doing so, he started rubbing shoulders with some pretty notable acts. Ace was 19 years old at this point, and actually going back to school to get his GED, believe it or not, for a girl, to impress a girl, but he also wanted it too. But he decided to go to the New York Pop Festival on Randall's Island in the East River on this day. And this was like a mini Woodstock. The lineup included Mountain, Steppenwolf, Jethro Tull, Grand Funk Railroad, Richie Havens, Van Morrison, Eric Clapton, and last but not least, the one and only Jimi Hendrix. Within 2 months, by the way, Jimi would be dead. I had a whole series on this channel about Jimi Hendrix's manager, Mike Jeffrey. I had to delete that episode for reasons I will not divulge. Let's just say someone emailed me and threatened me. And it was rude. But I do plan on remaking that episode, but I will omit certain things that that person was upset about. But either way, and maybe I'll say something along the lines of, and someone was upset about something. And then I will say it, but I won't really say it. Anyway, I did a whole deep dive on Jimi Hendrix death, and it will resurface maybe around Easter time, like the Lord, it shall rise again. But either way, on this day and on this show, Jimi Hendrix was on fire. This was the last time Jimi Hendrix performed in New York, and he was the ultimate guitar hero that night. So obviously, Ace sees this lineup and he has to go to this show. So he puts on his leather jacket and his tight yellow pants and headed out to the island with a couple of friends. Not really friends, but acquaintances. The people he came with went off somewhere once they got there, probably to get food or drinks, but Ace decided to walk around the back. He walked around the back of the stage, through the alleyway, and really tried to get some insight into the sausage making that was going on behind the scenes of this show. Now, after lurking near the back entrance for a while, he realized that roadies and crew and musicians, they were just walking in past security, and they would look at the security guy, but they would just kind of like give him a nod and walk in. So he thought to himself, hell, I can do that. I look the part, I look like a musician. I can just walk in and with confidence and nod at this guy. So he did. He just walked in with his head up, full of confidence, gave the security guy a head nod, and no one said a thing. And just like that, he was backstage at this insane festival. Not only was he backstage, but he decided to make himself at home a little bit. He made his way into this little eating area back there, and sitting at one of the tables was John Kay, the lead singer and songwriter and guitarist for Steppenwolf. At 19 years old, Ace just starts talking it up with John like they're long-lost friends, to the point where John eventually got up and went up to security and asked, like, who is this guy? And that, by the way, totally freaked Ace out. He didn't want to get in trouble or anything like that, so he just left and went into like a small hallway that was out of the way and minded his own business. But then another dude came up to him in that hallway and was asking him questions about who he played for, was he a roadie? And he said that he had been a roadie before. He wasn't playing with anybody, but he was just there for the show. And the guy goes, okay, cool. Well, could you help me set up some drums? And Ace was like, sure, yeah, I can set up drums. So he starts setting up, and then he realizes he is setting up drums for Mitch Mitchell, the drummer of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And his world nearly imploded. He was like, he couldn't believe it was happening. And then, as if that's not cool enough, Mitch Mitchell himself walked right up to him and shook his hand. And he totally fanboyed out. And he was like, Mitch, I love you. I love your drumming. And then he says he could feel the momentum. He could feel how Jimi Hendrix was about to come on stage, and everybody's kind of buzzing around. And then there's all this little hoopla. And then Jimi Hendrix walks up right past him, gets right on stage. Mitch is already up there. He's standing right there. He says he could have died in that moment and been happy. I think even to the day Ace died, which was just a few days ago, I think this was the highlight of his life. One of the major highlights of his life, if not, well, definitely the first highlight of his life. And like his dad said growing up to him, son, sometimes you get lucky. And his luck, by the way, was not about to run out. Oh no, well, as you know, but that night it wasn't about to run out because he got so enthralled with this backstage experience that after the show was over, he realized he had totally lost all of the people he came with. And obviously this is before cell phones and before Ubers and Lyfts. In fact, Randall Island is very isolated. And this was during a time too where public transportation was not just coming in and out of this area. So he genuinely had no way to get home. After this incredible experience, he is stranded. And it's actually funny because this is not the first show that Ace gets stranded at. He's actually kind of, I wouldn't say he's notorious for it, but there were a few times where he would go to a show and get so into the show that he would, like, he was at a Grateful Dead concert and he got locked inside of the show because he passed out. Well, that was a different situation. But in this case, he was just so distracted backstage, he forgot to go find the people he had come with to drive him home. So he then, and again, this is in 1970, it's a different time, but he walks out and has no choice but to hitchhike. So he goes out to the road, puts his thumb out, and a car pulls up, and the car says, "Hey, where are you trying to go to?" And he says his address. He says 2986 Marion Avenue in the Bronx. And the guy laughed and goes, "I'm going to Bedford Park Boulevard. Get on in." And then the driver goes, looks at him and goes, "I guess it's your lucky night, huh?" Not even knowing that he had just snuck backstage, set up the drums for the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and met all of these people. Now, unlike Don McLean, who literally just walked up to Pete Seeger after a show and was like, "Hi, I'm Don," and then it turned into this huge, musical opportunity for him. By the way, I do have a whole episode about Don McLean and American Pie. I will put it in the corner here, and I'll link it in the description down below. I love that story too, and I do talk about the moment that Don went up to Pete Seeger and just introduced himself. But unlike that, the connections that Ace made at this festival didn't reap immediate benefits for him, but it did give him a whole new level of confidence and energy that he then took back to the Bronx. At the time Ace met these people backstage, he was playing for a band called Honey, another young local band out of the Bronx, and they were mainly playing at churches and small clubs. But after this backstage experience, Ace looked at Honey and was like, no, I need to kick things up a notch. So then he joined a band called King Kong, which was certainly harder edged. It was a rock trio, but it was more mirroring the sounds of like Led Zeppelin and Mountain. It was louder. It was heavier. It allowed Ace to also start experimenting more with his kind of out there guitar solos and a little bit more of just wilder showmanship. It wasn't until King Kong was disbanding that Ace met John Ganter, and he was a keyboardist, and he also met Billy Squadron, a bassist, and both of them he met at a very small jam session right off of Fordham Road. But John and Billy were already part of a semi-professional rock band, definitely bigger than King Kong. This band was called Malimo. I always say Malimo, and then people say, no, it's Malimo. Malimo. What do you think? Either way, I'll say it the way that people yell at me to say it. Malimo. Ace joined Malimo as the lead guitarist. And it was this band that led him to RCA Records in Nashville, which, by the way, is right next door to me. I walk by it every single day with my dog. If you are ever in Nashville, I highly recommend the RCA tour. It is my favorite tour in Nashville. Whenever I see people kind of loitering outside RCA, I'll say like, have you done this tour? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And if they say no, I point in their face and I say, this is the best tour in Nashville. I remember the first time that I walked into RCA, and you can genuinely feel the energy and the spirits of the people who have been there. It is unlike anything in this world. And Ace describes that feeling and that energy when he walked in around 1972. In his own words, he said, if you care about music, that kind of history is palpable. You can feel it the moment you enter the room. And that's exactly the truth. The moment you enter RCA, just like the music gods take over it's like an out-of-body experience. It is so cool. But Ace was never really deeply passionate about Malimo. They were well-connected, certainly well-connected, and they gave him exposure to recording. And that was really great for him. That's really what he was after with this band. But they also only played original songs. So as a little side hobby, he and a couple others formed a more informal band to moonlight and have a little bit more fun with. They called themselves, are you ready for this? The Muff Divers. Yeah, with a name like that, you could tell they weren't really seeking longevity. This band just gave them a little bit more freedom to go play top 40 hits or other rock and roll hits or just play whatever they wanted to. Later that year, Ace saw an ad in the newspaper. It was December 17th, 1972 to be exact. The 17th, by the way, it seems to be a lucky day for him. July 17th, if you remember, was that lucky backstage moment at the festival. But now, on December 17th, 2 years later, he reads an ad in the Village Voice. And the ad said, lead guitarist wanted with flash and ability. Album out shortly. No time wasters, please. Signed, simply, Paul. Not to be confused with Ace, whose birth name was Paul. This was a different Paul. He had no idea who this Paul was, but he called the number anyway. He ended up talking to a guy who said his name was Paul Stanley, but he would later come to learn that the person he was speaking to on the phone, his real name was Stanley Eisen. And that is where everything changed. And that is also where I decided to cut this episode into 2 parts because it was becoming very long. So if you like this type of content and you want to see part 2, do not forget to hit the subscribe button and go to that little bell icon, click that bell icon, and change it from personalized to all. It defaults to personalized, which means every time I put out a new video, you will not see that new video in your YouTube feed because it defaults to a personalized feed, meaning I would have to put out a video that specifically caters towards your search history or your algorithm. So to make sure that you see part 2 of this episode, hit subscribe and change that setting to all. And in part 2, we are going to talk about the early days of Kiss and Ace's role in Kiss. We're also going to talk about a few of the downfalls that Kiss faced and the hurdles that they encountered in the music industry, which a lot of people forget about. A lot of people see Kiss and hear Kiss and think it was just easy street and they just rocked it from day one and they just succeeded from day one. And that is not the case at all. So if you like this type of content, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the thumbs up button. You have no idea how much it helps just to have one extra thumbs up and one extra subscribe. If you would like to be a member, you can also be a member of the channel where I come on and I do more informal coffee chats. I talk about things happening in Nashville, that sort of a thing. But subscribing is the best way to support the channel for free. And you also have the option to give the channel a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel and to these stories. Your subscriptions and, well, your super thanks, I should say, because subscriptions are free. But your memberships and your super thanks, they go directly towards all of the subscriptions that I have and that I pay for to do my research and to put on the production of these episodes. And of course, you guys, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.